Okay, folks, we do want to begin again, so if you could hold your conversations a bit, or if you must, quiet. So, I'm Philip Bennett again. I will be speaking for 45 minutes rather than a half hour, and the topic is the origins of Reich's, what I'm just going to call vegetal therapy. I'm not going to call it somatic psychology, because I have some concerns about that term, but I'll use his term, vegetal therapy, which he used until he came to the States where it became Orgone therapy. So I want to describe a typical psychoanalytic session in 1928, probably in Vienna or Berlin, because psychoanalysis, I mean, you do have Ernst Jones, but I'm not sure what was going on in London and not yet in the States, but we'll say Vienna. So the therapist is seated behind the patient. The patient is reclined on one of those couches. And I don't know if they still use those couches. Probably Eric Weitzner still uses those couches. But all the cartoons in the New Yorker, if they want to do a cartoon about psychoanalysis, there's that funny kind of curvy couch. And you can see Freud's funny kind of curvy couch if you go to his museum in Vienna.
Actually, there's one in London.
There you go, two. The therapist is sitting behind the patient. As I said, there's no eye contact. There is no physical contact. And in fact, there were some psychoanalysts who would refuse to shake hands with their patients, even though in German culture, shaking hands on meeting is like de rigueur. They wouldn't even touch their patients.
Surprising they entered the room.
Well, since they were seated, since they were seated behind the patient, one wonders about naps and the like. But in any case, the therapist or the psychoanalyst was generally quite passive. And Freud was very keen on this, that the process not be directed, that there would be encouragements. The patient would be encouraged to free associate, to report on dreams, but basically, apart from interpretations on occasion, the psychoanalyst is in a much more passive role here. Occasionally, the patient or the analysand might recall an event that would lead to some emotional release, but not necessarily, and with it symptomatic release, but not necessarily. And one would see a psychoanalyst like daily, at least 5 days a week, and I think in some cases 6 days a week. So I want to contrast that session, 1928, with Wilhelm Reich in Oslo, and I've been to the building where he did his therapy.
Phil, can I just ask you, how long were the sessions?
Don't know. Someone else can respond. I don't know if they were 50. Maybe they started an hour and slowly nibbled away. I don't know. No, I don't want to know. No, it's not terribly important. It's 1938 and we're in Oslo. The patient is lying on a couch in some form of undress. And if this is of interest to people, I brought a couple of passages, one from Morton Herskowitz's book about this, and one from a pamphlet by Chester Rayfield. And this should not be kept a secret. It's quite obvious if you read Mickey Sharaf's Fury on Earth. He talks about disrobing for therapy, and it shouldn't be a big deal. Nudity in Europe is, people are much more relaxed than they are in the States, but also these were medical doctors. And I disrobed from my urologist earlier this week. So in any case, if you're interested, I can read these passages about why the patient is in some state of undress in their underwear or something like that. Reich is seated directly alongside the patient, not behind the patient. He's encouraging the patient to breathe deeply and fully. And this is, between 28 and 38, radical difference. And we have to find what's the source of this radical change. He may be imitating the facial expressions of the patient or other bodily attitudes. He may attempt to provoke the patient, mirroring the patient's armored state, and attempt first to generate awareness of the armor, So really get you to feel where the holding is. And then to facilitate emotional release, which would lead to, hopefully, dissolution of the armor, at least to some degree. He might touch the patient, he might press at a certain place, but he's also doing character analysis throughout, and he's using what he learned as one of the best psychoanalysts in the circle. This may be a quote, or if not, it's very close. This new stuff, which he's calling vegetotherapy, he said at one point, vegetotherapy is character analysis of the body, and character analysis is vegetotherapy of the psyche. So there's still kind of a mind-body split going on here, but these are, for Reich, always functionally identical. There are two aspects of a single entity, not a dual entity, of a single entity, namely a person. And in fact, I think the key to the mind-body problem is to say that the person is the fundamental concept, and the person has different aspects. People have psychological aspects, they have physical aspects, etc., etc. So where did this new stuff come from? How in 10 years did we go from free association to this really radically different approach to helping people, where there's a center on the musculature and a centering on the breath? One thing I think is very important to recognize is that Reich was a great synthesizer. He, as Dr. Lewis said earlier, he was constantly rethinking his work and drawing. He did not ignore other people's work. He was not, a maniac or a megalomaniac or something like that who only looked at his own thinking. He was constantly borrowing. And you all know that famous quote of Newton's. By the way, I'm talking quickly because I have so much to share. If I'm talking too quickly, signal. You know that famous quote of Newton's about standing on the shoulders of giants. It's actually a very ancient remark about dwarfs on giants and things of that sort. Reich was highly original, but he was also a great synthesizer. The key idea associated with Wilhelm Reich, namely that all neuroses and all irrationality, both political and individual, is due to sexual repression, is certainly not an idea that Wilhelm Reich thought up. It's Sigmund Freud who thought up that idea. So he was a good borrower. Now, this year, 1928, is interesting because in that year, Otto Finichel, about whom I'll say more in a second, published a very interesting article. And if you look at the sheet I handed out with names and dates, did anyone not get a names, dates sheet? On the flip side, is a list of all the works I mentioned. And so you can see, well, I don't know, where is it? The very top, Otto Finichel, Orgone libidinization, etc. First, a word about Finichel. He was born in the same year as Reich, and when Reich came to Vienna in 1918, Reich was from the boonies. He was raised out in Bukovina, and then was in the war. Finichel was not in the war. When Reich came to Vienna in 1918, they met in med school and became very good friends, and they remained good friends until the mid-30s. Very close friends, in fact. More about that later. Finichel publishes this article in 1928 called Orgone libidinization, so already we're into the body, accompanying the defense against drives. And in this article, Finichel attributes, another name on the sheet, Sandor Firenzi, a Hungarian psychoanalyst who was about 20 years older than Reich, younger than Freud, attributes to Sandor Firenzi the studying of the organic phenomena, there's a quote, organic phenomena accompanying instinctual conflicts of the psychic apparatus. That Firenzi was making observations about physical accompaniments to psychological blocks. So, and I'll give you some specific. That particular is a reference to a paper of Firenzi's from 1919. A little bit about Sandor Firenzi, just so you have some history to go with the names. He was at one point Freud's fair-haired boy. He was like Freud's son. And there was There was even, I think, a reference that went on to Freud wanting to adopt him and make him a son. When Freud and Jung came to the States in 1909, I didn't see the film, but does Firenzi get into that film, the recent film? No.
Well, was it a bad movie?
It was a bad movie, okay. Good reason for me not to see it. When they came to the States in 1909, Firenzi came with him. And the correspondence between Firenzi and Freud is the most extensive. There's something like 2,000 letters in their correspondence. And it's now been published. So that's a little bit about Firenzi. He was interested in this physical manifestation of so-called psychological problems. And Reich talks about Firenzi in Function of the Orgasm. He says of Firenzi, this is a quote from Function in the most recent translation on page 151. Firenzi, that highly gifted and humanly outstanding man, was well aware of the dissoluteness in the field of therapy. He sought for the solution in the body. He developed, quote, an active technique focused on states of physical tension. But he was not familiar with the Stacey's neuroses, and he made the mistake of not taking the orgasm theory seriously. What was this active therapy of Firenzi by contrast with a very passive, traditional psychoanalysis? Well, for one thing, Firenzi would sometimes stop patients from talking and say, no, you've talked about that enough. Be still. What's behind what you're talking about? This is radical, given the standard, at least Freudian way of doing psychoanalysis. He would come out from behind the couch and sit next to the patient. He also did some very interesting stuff, like he once had a patient who was an opera singer who got very nervous when performing, so he asked her to sing an aria in the therapy room as a way of getting her to, notice her fears in a very palpable way. All of this is very, very different. But he also did some stuff that really raised eyebrows, especially for Freud. He would sometimes hold his patients and reportedly kiss them. Now, I don't know if these were paternal kisses or kissing on the lips. I know that Freud, there's a letter from Freud to Firenzi where he admonishes him and sort of uses a slippery slope argument. Well, if you're kissing them, then fondling can't be far behind. I don't know why he thought that, but that's interesting. But in any case, Firenzi saw therapy as much more collaborative and much more active process. Here, I don't know if it would be helpful. I'd like to say something about Reich as psychoanalyst, because we know about Reich as vegetotherapist or orgone therapist. But there is, would that be of interest? Where you think? Okay. There is an insight into Reich as a psychoanalyst. For one thing, he was generally known as the character smasher. I think that's a term that Richard Sturba used to describe him, but he was very, very powerful and a very effective psychoanalyst. But Firenzi, going back to Firenzi for a second, when people would come from the States, Firenzi would say, go study with Reich. And there are two people in particular who are kind of important, Walter Brill and O. Spurgeon English. Yeah. English, this guy from Maine, very interesting character. Brill was very important because he made possible Reich's coming to the New School. He funded Reich's courses at the New School, and Reich paid him back with therapy, and it's a whole interesting story. English has written about his psychoanalysis with Reich. And some of you are seeing nods, so maybe some of you have read this. It's called Some Reflections on a Psychoanalysis of Wilhelm Reich, September 1921, April 1932, and it's on your sheet of references. The date in the article title is clearly a mistake. It had to be 1930, because he says once he began therapy, 2 months later, Reich moved to Berlin. Well, Reich moved to Berlin in November of 1930. So English at least got the date wrong. I don't know if he got anything else wrong. But this, I just want to read a passage from English's description of his therapy with Reich. It was at this time I recall Dr. Reich utilizing his interest in other than verbal presentations of the personality. So he's talking very early here. We're talking 1930, 31, early 32. For instance, he would frequently call attention to the monotony of my tone of voice as I free associated. So very interesting. He would also call attention to my position on the couch. And I remember particularly that he confronted me with the fact that when I entered and left the office, I made no move to shake hands with him, as was the custom in both Austria and Germany. In December 31, English goes back to the States briefly. He had been on some kind of a fellowship, and he has to go back to the States. But he does come back to Berlin to continue his therapy. But when he's leaving, this is what he recalls. I recall that just before I left in December of 1931, he was speaking of my cool detachment still existent at the time, and made a remark I did not understand then, but which I have pondered since. He said that my difficulty in expressing much positive feeling toward him might result in my developing a bellyache. This is fascinating, that Reich is already thinking about, you know, somatic illnesses, so to say. I don't know, well, it depends on how you understand a bellyache. In connection with some kind of psychological block. Well, actually, this is not that surprising. I want to go back to this Finishel article that I mentioned to begin with, and just share with you some bullet points from that article. I think this article is must-reading for anyone interested in Reich and quote-unquote somatic psychology. First, Finishel observes that there's a great degree of muscular tenseness in so-called healthy people, at least in our culture. And so he's already talking about muscular armor, though he doesn't use that term. Finishel also refers to the entire autonomic system being involved in these phenomenon of organic repression, the ways in which the system is repressing itself. And that's very interesting because those of you who have read Reich know that Reich makes much about the autonomic nervous system, about the parasympathetic and sympathetic aspects of the autonomic nervous system, and how one correlates with pleasure and one correlates with anxiety, and he has a whole list. If you read in Function of the Orgasm, you can see this. But now this is also interesting. These observations are being attributed to Firenzi by Finishel. He says that the inhibitions involve movement inhibitions, or so-called suppressed motor impulses. And Landauer, third character here, claimed, quote, that in certain conditions the motor inhibitions thus established in childhood are retained throughout life. So the patterns of muscular holding that are inflicted on young people, because one could say that our characters are pretty much shaped by year of 5, by the age of 5, these characteristic patterns of holding will be retained throughout life. This leads, and again this is a quote, to a functional change in the skeletal musculature. This is an article in 1928. The tenseness of the muscles is a means of keeping, again, quote, a means of keeping repressed material in repression. So here you have the whole of Reich's theory being laid out in this article by Finishel. And all of these observations are being attributed to Firenzi. And there's even a quote from a 1925 article by Firenzi, with progress, the quote, with progress in the analysis, a consequent resolution of psychic tensions, the somatic tensions may also vanish. So again, you see stuff that will become central to Reich's vegetative therapy. There's even a reference in this article to what Reich comes to call the pelvic block. Again, 1928, this is Finishel writing. This impression is enhanced by the observation that the most extreme degrees of cramp, muscular armoring, occur in the musculature of the pelvis, both in that of the floor of the pelvis and in the hip joints, an observation which is in agreement with the fact that what succumbs to repression is, in the main, the representatives of sexual drives. So you also, there's a reference to Velma Kovács, another Hungarian psychoanalyst, who argued that muscular rigidity, quote, is for maintaining and hiding sexual excitement. There's also in the same article by Finishel a reference to breathing, and that's very interesting. He talks about the cessation of breathing and anxiety. Now that's not a hard idea to come to. I mean, we all know holding our breath when we get scared. But I think in Finishel's case, there's something deeper here that I'll turn to in a moment. What's interesting is that with all these observations, that doesn't mean that psychoanalysts changed anything. There's only one psychoanalyst who incorporated these observations into practice, and that was Wilhelm Reich. He was the only one that went, well, if you're seeing all this stuff, let's look at the body, and let's start thinking of how to help someone from the body perspective. I want to introduce now to the discussion Elsa Gindler. Gindler was living in Berlin. She had had some kind of affliction, I forget what it was, and she, quote, healed herself. And studying herself, she came to realize the centrality of breathing in the muscular block she was feeling in her organism. And so she developed a kind of therapy through movement. Finichel leaves Vienna in 1922, moves to Berlin, meets Claire Nathanson in January 1924, who later becomes Claire Finichel. Claire Nathanson had been taking classes with Gindler since 1915. And Finichel took classes with Gindler, and he said, at least according to this one source, and it's on the sheet, that after a few hours of coursework with Gindler, his headaches ceased. So he was kind of sold on this. He actually gave a talk at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Society called On Psychoanalytic Reflections of Working Principles of Gymnastics. And hold on to the term gymnastics, it will become important later. So Finichel is integrating what he's learning through both his wife and directly from Elsa Gindler. When Reich moves to Berlin in 1930, in November 1930, and he and Annie Reich, Annie Pink Reich, his wife at the time, resume their close contact with the Finichels, and they go hiking with them, etc. Eva Reich recalls, the source, by the way, for all this stuff about Gindler and Reich is Eva, and if it was just Eva, I'd be a little cautious because at times she says stuff that I wasn't sure wasn't always correct. But there's also Claire Finichel writing in her diaries about this, so I think if you have two sources, I think it's pretty good as a historian. I would like three, and there is a third source that I'll mention in a moment, but at least you got two sources here. When they would go hiking, Reich would constantly ask the Finichels, what is she doing in these classes? And according to Eva, she actually went to a Gindler kind of school. And she remembers they would crawl over furniture and under furniture and how good this felt. And Eva's opinion is that it was Gindler's influence through the Finichels that led Reich to bring breath into the whole therapeutic process. Whether she's correct about that or whether it was Reich's own observations, I don't know, but now there's a further player in the mix, namely Elsa Lindenberg. Elsa Lindenberg was a dancer with the Opera House in Berlin. She was also a student of Gindler's. And in fact, she developed a kind of dance, expressive dance therapy, Lindenberg did, and using Gindler's insights. And Lindenberg, after the war, Lindenberg stayed in Oslo through the war and had a very, very hard time of it. Reich did try to get her to come to the States, but unsuccessfully. After the war, she went back to Berlin to study further with Gindler. So there's no doubt that Lindenberg and Gindler had this strong connection. Well, who was Elsa Lindenberg? Well, Elsa Lindenberg was wife number 2 of the 4 wives of Wilhelm Reich. Annie Reich, Elsa Lindenberg, Ilse Ohlendorf, and finally Aurora Carrara. Of those 4 wives, 2 of those marriages, they were factually married. In 2 cases, they were also legally married, but, you know, for Reich, he always talked about factual marriage. Elsa Lindenberg and Reich met on May Day 1932, demonstrating in the streets of Berlin. Reich, at one point, I think Elsa was cold and he gave her his jacket, and that was the beginning of their wonderful romance. I won't go into the details there except to say that Elsa was teaching this adjunct to vegetotherapy, a kind of movement therapy. And in fact, some of you may have heard of Bjorn Blumenthal. Bjorn Blumenthal runs the Institute for Vegetotherapy in Oslo. He's in his 80s now, a friend of mine. His introduction to Reich was as a college student taking classes with Elsa Lindenberg, and that's how he first heard about Reich. This is right after the war. Now, I said hold on to the reference to gymnastics. I want you now to we're moving now from Germany, Oslo, to the United States. Reich comes to the United States in the fall of 1939, begins teaching as an adjunct at the New School, in good company. Dr. Lewis has followed in his steps and is also a teacher at the New School. Reich puts out his first English language journal in 1942. It's called the International Journal for Sex Economy and Orgone Research, the IJSO. I should have put that on my, well, there is a reference to it on my list. In the very first journal of the IJSO, the very first article is, quote, about the history and the activities of our institute. And here Reich is summarizing for an American audience, now in English for the first time. All of his writings up to then have been in German, about the kind of work he does. And this is a quote from that article. There is as yet no pedagogical group, nor one for therapeutic gymnastics. This is fascinating. The suggestion is that in Oslo there was a group for therapeutic gymnastics, and now we don't have one yet in the United States, and there was also a group studying pedagogy and how children are being raised. In the next volume of the IJSO, 1943 volume, there is indeed an article by a woman named Lucile Bella, it's on the list, called Vegetotherapeutic Gymnastics. And in it she says the principles of vegetotherapeutic gymnastics were first worked out by Elsa Lindenberg, a co-worker of Dr. Reich's in Norway, beginning about 1936. And it was always seen as an adjunct to therapy, not a replacement of therapy. And Bellamy in this article says she only is working with people who are actively in orgone therapy. So in addition to whatever was going on in the orgone therapeutic session, some people would do this gymnastics. Now what is involved in that gymnastics, I know not. And what is involved, maybe you'll tell us later, but hold on one second, let me finish this up. I'm close. After this article by Bellamy, there's one other reference, but basically this talk about therapeutic gymnastics sort of fades away. And when you talk, or you look at the people who today practice what they believe is Reich's kind of therapy, the Institute for Ergonomic Science, the institute that's sponsoring this event, you don't hear talk about this stuff. So I don't know why and what the history is there, but in any case, it was very much part of the work. Reich himself first uses, pardon me, I guess gotta see how long I got set up 15 minutes. That's pretty good. Reich himself first uses the phrase muscular armor in an article entitled Psychic Content and Vegetative Streaming. Did I put that on here? I hope I did. Yeah. This is a talk he gave at Lucerne. Everyone reaches for their cell phones. Oh, there we go. This is a talk Reich gave at Lucerne in 1934 at this absolutely unspeakably unprincipled occurrence of Reich's finding when he goes to Lucerne for this international conference that he's no longer a member of the International Psychoanalytic Association because he, quote, resigned from the German Psychoanalytic Association. And actually, if you read Ernest Jones' Life of Freud, you will see Ernest Jones says very directly, Reich resigned. This is absolute bullshit. Reich was thrown out, and he was thrown out for political reasons because they were trying to make psychoanalysis palatable to the Nazis in Germany. They wanted to be, quote, apolitical, whatever that means. In any case, in this article, Psychic Contact and Vegetative Streamings, Reich talks for the first time about muscular armor. In 1937, and this is, I think, very significant, in 1937, he publishes an article, a pamphlet, called Orgasm Reflex, Muscular Attitude, and Body Expression on the technique of character analytic vegetotherapy. But he publishes this pamphlet together with an article called Dialectical Materialism in Life Research, Report on the Bion Experiments. So in one publication, if you had this, you would have his biological work on these little energy vesicles, which he's calling bions, which are like transitional entities between living and non-living material, and you have an article on character analytic vegetotherapy. What ties the two together is, of course, the movement of energy. So you could talk about the movement of energy on the macro level in the human organism, or the blocks there too, in terms of muscular armor, or you can talk about the movement of energy on the cellular level. And I thought that was very an interesting observation that he published these two articles together, bound together. So where did this new practice come from? Go back to 1928, 1938. It seems to me the influence of Lindenberg has to be there. I mean, this was his partner for 7 years. And the influence through Lindenberg of Gindler has to be there, and how much Gindler through Finichel is there is also an open question. And then all these references to gymnastics. In Reich's scientific autobiography, I'm referring to the function of the orgasm, because the first function of the orgasm is the function of the orgasm, the one published in 27. The one published in English is really a summary of his work. It's his scientific autobiography. When you read Reich's function of the English function of the orgasm, there's no mention of Lindenberg in the context of the development of this, nor is there any reference to gymnastics. It's just not there. He gives a historical summary of the development of his therapy and character analysis in a chapter called The Expressive Language of the Living, and which he wrote in the winter of '48. And it appeared in the 3rd edition of Character Analysis. Here he states that the orgasm reflex was discovered in 1935. It's interesting, because he's talked about the function of the orgasm, but now specifically talking about the orgasm reflex. And if you're not sure what that means, I'm sure Dr. Lewis or Dr. Schiff can fill that in. Was studied in 1935, and he says that's when treatment, quote, shifted from the character to the body. I don't like that quote, because again, that's kind of a dualistic perspective, and I think Reich was constantly working on multiple levels. It is true that there was a time when he focused much more on the muscular armor. And there was even, you know, the use of later development technologies, the doorbuster and the shooter and things of that sort. And of course the use of the accumulator, at least in certain cases. But I think Reich was always treating the whole person and going at the armor in a variety of ways. And here, by way of summary or conclusion, I think what distinguished Reich's, quote, body work from other approaches, what I already said in response to Dr. Schiff's opening statement, is the centrality of the orgasm function. It's not enough to talk about body, it's not enough to talk about body energy. That can all be very vague and can easily descend into all kinds of mystical stuff. And here, I want to, I'm not saying this to be provocative, but I want to suggest that I think that a, quote, somatic approach that doesn't recognize the centrality of the sexual function can actually sometimes be harmful, because I think energy can be mobilized, and if that energy is mobilized in a way where there isn't some notion of the flowing release, I think people can get into trouble. And I think sometimes people who are using this work without working systematically, especially, and here I differ from the bioenergetics, I think it's important to work from the head down, and so you avoid a kind of a split. People who are not working systematically, I think, can sometimes do damage. But I don't know, that's something Dan can better speak to than I can. So, The origins of Reich's vegetal therapy, well, I think he was a keen observer of human beings. I think he was a keen observer of himself. I mean, he sometimes does psychoanalytic writing about himself. His first book is really about him, the impulsive character. He was a keen synthesizer, and I've given you those possible sources that he may have been very well synthesizing to reach what we now call orgone therapy. And with that, I will stop speaking. Since I'm ending about 8 minutes early, before you offer your commentary, are there any questions for clarifying what I said? If I said something that was off, you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to say that, very simply, that gymnastics is really translated as movement or exercise rather than
what we think. Yeah, no, I didn't think it was like parallel bars or anything like that. Yes, yes, please.
One thing that in the United States, Charlotte Selber, who lived to 110 or something and taught till the last day, was a student of Ilse Gindler, who worked in New York and other places, and always, in every class, referred to my esteemed teacher, Ilse Gindler. Did you work with her too?
Ilse Gindler was the teacher of many of the seminal dance therapists.
Yes.
She was a teacher of Laban. She was,
Yes.
and
A student of Laban. Oh, no, a teacher of Laban.
Yes.
Because Elsa Lindeberg was a student of Laban.
yes,
And at the
Yeah.
Dance Notation Bureau, the senior teachers at DNB were marking and related to us again. So was Feldenkrais.
So here you have a source that not many people in orgonomy recognize, since Reich never talks about her, or never mentions her.
Right.
Dr. Lewis, please.
Just one quick question. The term gymnastics, often translated, you have to put that in the historical context, that gymnastic and naturism was a central part of the life and culture of this group that Reich was part of, basically the Bohemian intellectual circles. So you'll see photographs, which many of you have seen from that period, of naked bodies with barred balls throwing,
moving around.
And so gymnastics tends to be interpreted in this country often as rolling and and sort of physical gymnastic, Olympic style gymnastics. This was not what it was.
No, of course.
So historically, it doesn't have the same meaning that we tend to place on it. It's not as trivial a term used then as it is now.
Yeah, Johanna was breaking that out in
Yeah.
her comments as well, and I think that's important. But what I find interesting, and I don't know, someone would have to be my historical, as a historian, I'm newly minted as a historian, my training is as a philosopher. I'm only in Germany so far. I haven't gotten out of Germany. Well, I'm in Oslo too, but I haven't gotten to the States. So I don't know what happened to this kind of adjunct to orgone therapy that Bellamy writes about, and that was clearly part of the scene in Oslo. And it could be that as Reich came to understand orgone energy much better, maybe he thought that the therapy had it built in or something. I don't know. And that's, I don't know if you know anything about that, Dr. Lewis, or if Dr. Schiff.
I think part of it is, if you're reading even Reich's recent point, he tended to see that as all being, he had a tendency to see finally everything as being part of it. Anecdotally, Dr. Sobey and Dr. Hanlon confirmed this, that Reich would often say to the students, oh, you guys are all too interested in psychology, you're too interested in all these other small adjunctive, these pieces. You have to look at the whole, which I'll address in my piece. So I think that's a crucial thing, is that he tended not to be that interested in whether this was a part of it or that was a part of it.
I understand that, but no, my question was slightly different. There was clearly people doing this, at least one, Lucile Bella, because she writes this article about her practice and how she would work with people in therapy, and yet that history seems to fade out. Now, there are other histories, the reference to a pedagogical group, that does come into existence with the Children of the Future project, and I've spoken about that at one of these meetings in the past, but that took a while, and that petered out for a very good reason. But I don't recall in the history references to this vegetal therapy, gymnastics, and it dissolving. hold on one second. I want to get anyone else who hasn't had a chance to speak yet before I recognize some of the. Okay, and actually, I should. Oh, go ahead, Dorothy, and then I should turn the floor over to my respondent.
What about Felicia Sachs and gymnastics?
Well, that was the other person I was thinking of, but since that's such a sorry story in the history of Orgone, I wanted to ignore it. But she did do something. I'm not exactly sure which. Well, I want to ignore that whole issue. But there is an article again in the IJSO by Felicia Sachs about her work with children, and I think, if my memory is correct, that involves some kind of movement therapy, but things then got confused. Let's put it that way. Last comment, and then let me respond. This gentleman.
There was a small school in Media, Pennsylvania called Green Tree, and it was basically the school for the ergonomic community, and they did a lot of movement work at the Green Tree School, and it still exists.
Okay, Dr. Weitzner, this is your time, and then that'll open up into questions, etc. My respondent takes the floor, and he'll keep it to around 5. So
that may actually be less.
He'll keep it to.
No, I think, Dr. Bennett's contribution is a very important one. It's important for us to understand where Reich, as a person and as a thinker and as a therapist, came from and what his position is in history. I'm not a historian. I don't envy for having become one, but I admire him because these are very difficult questions. When I read The Function of the Orgasm, I kind of naively assumed that, well, this is where it came from. Reich was in his office. He was doing psychoanalytic therapy. He couldn't break through the resistances using the usual methods of interpretation and free association, and so he started making observations about what was going on. And he presented, as all scientists tend to do, he presented it as his own discovery. But I wonder, to what extent was Reich a product of his time, and to what extent was he ahead of his time? I think the idea of sexuality is central to the development of his thinking and his technique. And I think we have to give Freud credit for having blown away the great taboo about talking about sexuality, especially about childhood sexuality. But we also have to recognize that Freud had a tremendous limitation of being afraid of sexuality. And if you read his writings on civilization and sexuality, it's abundantly clear that he recognized childhood sexuality, but he was afraid of it. He thought that there was an antithesis between sexuality and instincts in general and civilization. And the only way civilization came about was by suppressing sexuality, and this was Freud's reality. You just have to live with it. Reich did not have this limitation. And not only did he not have this limitation, but he had the audacity to suggest that society should allow sexuality to become free, even in children and adolescents. So in that way, he was way ahead of his time. It's still not happening much. It happens as much as it's possible. And the focus on the body is something which has turned out to be prescient. And the functional unity, functional identity of the body and the mind is prescient and still has not been realized. This guy, what's his name, who wrote Descartes' Error? That's neurologist. Damasio. His book, I believe, is based on, or it leads in the direction of an indissociability of mind and body. You can't take one. So how long did it take for neurologists to come to this conclusion, which Reich had come to in the 1930s? I'll stop.
Oh, okay. Let me just say one thing about the fear of sexuality. And I just want to share, and I wish I had written down the title of the article, but if you email me, I'll give it to you. There was an article by a scholar, it was originally written in German, a woman's dissertation, where she traced the attitudes of Freud to people who varied from the straight and narrow as Freud understood it. And Freud constantly would dismiss these people as Meshuggah. And he would use that Yiddish word, which Germans easily recognize, but he would say, oh, that one's Meshuggah, and that one's Meshuggah. He defended Reich, by the way. Freud never said that Reich was Meshuggah, but certainly Jung was Meshuggah, Rank was Meshuggah, Firenzi was Meshuggah. And I think there is this way in which anxiety generated by people's thinking, where if you can't handle the movement of energy in your own body, the best thing you can do is pathologize the source of the excitation and label someone Meshuggah or label someone crazy. And we see that, of course, with Reich as his ideas develop in the 30s, and that's when some people first start referring to him in pathological language, and that continues throughout his career. So that kind of anxiety.
But isn't it true, Philip, that Freud rejected outright the orgasm theory as misguided?
Well, he certainly did what you said about posing this antithesis between civilization or societal development and sexuality. Reich gave a paper in December 1929 in Freud's rooms about the prevention of neuroses, the prophylaxis of neuroses. December 12, 1929, because the next night Reich was leading the Revolutionary Social Democrats in Vienna. It's a whole other side of Reich's politics, which I've written about and talked about. He gave this paper in Freud's rooms, and I think this was the last time he gave a paper in that setting. And Freud's reaction was to Reich's civilization and its discontents. At least that's Reich's interpretation, and I think it's correct. That there was no way of preventing neuroses unless you're going to give up being civilized human beings. And for Reich was always concerned with the prevention of neuroses, and that, of course, leads us into social change. And this is another thing that often gets left out, as you reminded us earlier, and there are people who do orgone therapy who don't understand the radical political implications of Reich's perspective. But enough for me. I think it's time to open it to the floor, either addressing your comments to Dr. Weitzner or myself. So anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak yet first? And then we go to, yes, please, John.
I just wanted to say very briefly that the integration of Reich's work and Lindbergh's work is alive and well in Oslo, in Norway. That there is an integration of the Reichian community and the dance community that has maintained itself.
That's good to know. I didn't see that when I was there. I mean, I met not all, but I met many of the people who were in the Institute of Vegetative Therapy, because I stayed in Bjorn Blumenthal's home and lectured there. I didn't meet the dance
It's the dance therapy people that
did
are
not
the
meet
integrators of it.
Next time I go, I'll make sure that I do. Any other questions or comments? Please, sir.
I think that question about the relationship, Freud then has sublimation as the answer to the problems of, necessary repression. And I think so many social thinkers that have incorporated Freud and Marx without taking in Reich have argued for the necessity of repression and argued for sublimation. Marcuse actually, uses the term repressive desublimation for, people who are engaged in sexual pleasure in the 60s. So it becomes, for so much, a deep frustration of mine with my colleagues who do social thought, is they say, look, you can't have sexual freedom. That just leads to chaos, and they really follow Freud's conservative line.
Well, there's also the very important point that what gets called sexual freedom is often a dramatic distortion of Reich's ideas.
Yes, right. It's not emotional freedom.
Right. It's just the, anything goes kind of thing. And Reich was not, for Reich, sexuality and love are very importantly connected. But this thing about is sublimation, Reich also does talk about sublimation. And he does say that there are times when, the situation might demand sublimating one's energies in a variety of ways, like if he was working on something in a particular moment or something. Dr. Lewis, please.
And just that Reich refers to this as as functional sublimation. It has a natural function.
Right.
Reich was, in reference to this, the real answer comes in through A.S. Neal, who hasn't been mentioned here yet, in terms of his book, not
Freedom, Not License.
Freedom, Not License. And clearly, and they're in the letters of Reich and Neal, which are a wonderful source of really understanding how Reich collaborated. They talk about the fact that Reich always had problems about America and the groups around him, which is my last comment quickly here, is that this whole thing about Reich and groups and how he saw these. Reich, from all the personal accounts of people who worked closely with Reich, had great, by the time he came to the United States, and for good reason, had great distrust of groups, including the ergonomic groups around him, the people around him, in the sense of what they do. So he had a tendency to, distance himself from groups that represented any particular movement or even any movement within his own work. Dr. Sobey explained that he once actually allowed some people in New York to experiment with group psychotherapy using ergonomic principles, and within about 6 or 7 weeks of the initial session, he suddenly just canceled it, which he tended to do, and basically said, it's not going to happen, all the guys that are coming to the group are just looking to get laid.
So let me say one thing about Reich distancing himself from organization. I think in Reich's own character we see a tension. On the one hand, being very principled, and if that meant leaving someone behind, he would leave him behind. If you couldn't stay up with him, so to say, you left. At the same time, grieving his isolation and loneliness. And I think this is a characterological thing worth noting in Reich, and maybe in others who come up with a great insight which they doggedly defend in the face of all kinds of controversy, all kinds of denigration, that there's a tendency towards isolation, and I think that happened in his case, and I think ultimately that led to certain problems in this case.
Like Freud had the same problem, and Darwin in his own way had the same problem. This is a very interesting historical moment, how these kind of protein figures really deal with this duality.
Right.
The Nietzschean problem of Zarathustra, who at the end just walks away.
And Reich struggles with expressing this in The Murder of Christ, because you get a sense in The Murder of Christ, his Christ is a very lonely guy. He's doing these great things, but he is alone. And so and he wrote that long before before Reich made that very beautiful and sorrowful take, Alone, which I irreverently can imitate his tone of voice, but I won't be a naughty boy.
And then also his characterization of himself as a silent observer.
There's that.
But
which is very interesting.
Just to put in my 2 cents about sublimation, I don't think Reich was against it. It's just an unfortunate term, sublimation. People talk about work and knowledge rather than sublimation. But why in psychoanalysis, there's aim inhibition, where, for example, you have feelings of tenderness deprived of the sexual aim. And then on the other hand, there's sublimation, where you create a work of art or a scientific theory. And it's just very ill defined. But sublimation should not be thought of necessarily as something.
Repression.
Yeah, as something counter, antithetical to the instincts. It's actually, a form of energy discharge, but it can't be quantitatively sufficient without direct sexual gratification.
Yeah, it's important. I'm glad you reminded us of the motto, love, work, and knowledge.
Right.
Well, obviously, when you're working and you're gaining your knowledge, you're not loving. And so, okay, it is my time is up. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your comments. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Harry Lewis.